All right, it's good to see so many people here. This is great. All right, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So just as a reminder, on Canvas, there is a class page for each day where we meet on Zoom. I'm just going to mute you for a second, Robert. Okay. There's always a class page for the Tuesday and the Thursday each week. So for today's class, part of the reason for this is for me to show you a list of what we're going to cover. So before the class, you can still see it. And then there's also, this is an area where I show links, of course. On today's page for today's class, I've put this EPUB file. I just uploaded this just a minute ago. And this is a list of your names in the class. And next to each name, there is a font. So this is the font that you're going to use for project number 1. Remember that for the first project, what you're going to be doing is creating a poster for a particular font. And you're going to also break down its anatomy and show certain parts of it. So the idea of this project is for you to get kind of exposed to a variety of different fonts. So all of the fonts that are on this list, by the way, I've chosen from the Adobe font collection, which means that anybody that's doing this class, if you have the Adobe Creative Cloud, which you should have to run this, to do this class, even though this is not a software class, we will be doing stuff in software. So you'll need to have the Adobe Creative Cloud to do that with. When you have the Adobe Creative Cloud, so that includes Illustrator, Photoshop, InDesign, After Effects, Animate, all sorts of different software. But going along with that package, you also get access to thousands of fonts through the Adobe font collection. So all of these fonts are available through there. So you can activate any of these fonts, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. So that was on the class for today. I will also try to remember to post it to the assignment as well, so you have easy access to it there. And I'll send an announcement for anybody that's not in the Zoom as well. So there'll be a couple of different places where you can find that if you forget where it is. So again, that's just sort of explain. It's just allocating a font for you to use for project 1. Okay. So here's the other things that we're going to go over in today's class. Introduce worksheet number 1, bio sheet, demonstrations for worksheet number 1, bio sheet, software that we're going to use, basic terminology for space, and this is specifically for typography. So adjusting space between different areas. We're really going to talk about kerning, tracking, and leading initially, and then I've allocated the font, so that's what that list is about. I was going to talk about the power of type. I think I might do this as a separate video, so we'll see if I get time. Probably won't get time for that anyway. And then if anybody has questions, I'll take questions from students. So before I go any further, has anybody got any questions right now that you want to ask me? You all good?
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead, Daisy.
So with the typefaces that we got assigned, will we be choosing the font regular?
Well, let me show you the assignment real quick.
Because I see that they have the multiple fonts.
They have a family, yeah. So you're actually going to, it's a poster for that particular font. So you might want to choose to show different weights of the font, actually.
Okay.
And it'll depend a little bit on the font. So I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail real quickly. So if we go into the assignment itself, Project 1, you're going to design a poster that's 11 by 17. It can be vertical or horizontal. You'll be assigned a typeface, so I've just done that. And then this way, all students will be doing a different font. I didn't want everybody to just choose a font, because then what happens is that we'll get 6 people doing the same font. And it doesn't really help us to get exposed to a bunch of different typefaces. And I've also chosen typefaces that fall into a bunch of different categories. So some of them are more like handwriting. Some of them are sans serif, some of them are serif. Some of them are more friendly. Some of them are very kind of austere. And so there's a bunch of different fonts in there for you to take a look at. And we can talk about those characteristics of typefaces, which is, at the heart of sort of understanding typography, is understanding the nuance of change between one font and another, how different, very subtle differences can really alter the impression that the font creates. So I will post a PDF file, and I've just done that. So you're going to have the name of the font, a brief description of the font, including the year it was designed, and the designer's name. You must show the baseline, X height, cap height. You must show at least 6 parts of the typeface's anatomy: a counter, bowl, ascender, descender, etc. So if you look at the anatomy of type, and we'll talk about this more over the next week or so, there's all the different parts of the letter forms have terminology that goes along with it. So what I would like you to do is to label those different parts of the letter forms in some way or another. And then you were asking me about whether you'd want to use a whole family. So there's a couple of things about that. One of them is that you could utilize the family as part of the design so that you can create hierarchy within the design. I'll show you some examples of student projects. So bear with me for a second whilst this loads. I'm going to turn my video off because I think it saves a little bit of memory. So on this one, for instance, it looks like it's only showing the one way, although actually this is a different weight from that. On this one, it's just showing the one weight by the looks of it. This one does show all the different weights. So it's got light, book, regular, medium, heavy. This looks like it's probably either in book or regular. And then this here is probably in medium. So you could use it. What I mean by creating a sense of hierarchy. So this is a more important information. You want it to have some impact. So using a bolder weight would obviously give you that impact. Now, some of the fonts that I'm allocating you don't have a big family. They might not have a family at all. It might be one font. Also, some of those fonts are very much what you would call a display font. So there are sort of everyday sans serif and serif typefaces. This is an example of a sans serif typeface, right? Where it doesn't have those kind of little feet that you get on the ends of letter forms. This is an example of what's referred to as a slab serif font. So it has these serifs, which are very chunky. Rockwell is one of those fonts. So it's a slab serif typeface. And then you also get serif typefaces like Times, where it has these regular sort of serifs. So does that help sort of answer your question, Daisy?
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Okay, let me just go back to the page for the module for the class. So I think that's everything I need to point out for right now. There is, like I said, there's that link of student examples you can take a look at. There's a visual guide to the anatomy of type here. So if you go into here, it shows you the different parts of the typeface. I think I'd shown this in the Monday Zoom, so I'm not going to go over it again. But you can click on this and it breaks down those different parts, because remember that as part of this project, you need to call out certain parts of the letter forms, different parts of the strokes, maybe something which is particularly unique to that typeface. So if we were to look at some of the typefaces that I've chosen on this list, if we were to look at Adobe Garamond, I'm going to go to the Adobe font site. Thought I had it open, but I must have closed it. Let's go to Adobe fonts. So if you go to the Adobe font website and you look for fonts, you can search in here for a particular font. So I'm looking for Adobe Garamond. I can paste that into there, hit return. And if you're signed into the Adobe font website, this is where you can also activate those fonts. So if you want to use it. So this is this particular font. And you can see that there's a little button that says add family. So I could click here and then I would have access to that Adobe Garamond font. I thought actually I had this one already loaded. It also gives you a little bit of a description about the font. So an Adobe original design, the Adobe's first historical revival, Adobe Garamond is a digital interpretation of the Roman types of Claude Garamond and italic types of Robert Grandjean. Since its release in 1989, Adobe Garamond has become a typographic staple. So I'm not going to read that whole thing, but you get the idea. So you can find something out about this font. Having a little bit of an understanding of the history of a font can give you a better understanding of its appropriateness in a particular context, particularly when you're first learning. It helps you to gauge the historical context of these fonts. What do those fonts mean? What they mean to some extent is like, when are they from? So it's not the only thing, but it certainly plays into it. The story behind it, and also the category of font. Is it an old style typeface? That type of thing. It also has here recommendations. So under recommendations, it has fonts that are like Adobe Garamond. Also here, it has what are called font pairings. So we'll talk more about font pairings as we go through the course, but in graphic design, as a general rule of thumb, we usually use two typefaces or two fonts. So you might use more than that occasionally, obviously, like anything, like any rule, you could break those rules sometimes. But they're oftentimes fonts that aren't like the same as each other, obviously, because there's no point in doing that. They oftentimes contrast each other, but they also are meant to go with each other, you know, so they're designed to go with each other. A little bit like pairing food and wine, perhaps. All right. If you think of it as like an analogy. So we're trying to find fonts. So here it makes suggestions for font pairings. So Adobe Garamond with Tablet Gothic Wide Regular, they're pairing it with a sans serif typeface in this case. Those two typefaces, the two main categories of typefaces, right? You have sans serif, which doesn't have those little decorative feet elements at the bottoms of letter forms. And then you have, so sans literally means without serifs. And then you have serif typefaces. So within those categories, we get other categories like humanist sans serif typeface, old style serif typefaces, transitional serif faces, and so on. But you can see here, this is particularly helpful if you're not very familiar with type. Getting a sense of which fonts might work well together. This could at least give you some kind of confidence in that regard, you know, like how do I choose a font is a sort of age-old problem for designers, or age-old as far as the digital revolution has been concerned. Anyway, like choosing the fonts that go together is a part of your process that you have to do on a regular basis. All right, I'm going to get out of there for a second. Let me go back. So this is another font which is on the list, Zebrawood. This is a very different font. This is what's referred to as a display typeface. So a display typeface is one that you would use like as a headline or for a poster or something like that, maybe for a logo type or something along those lines, but you wouldn't use it for body copy. So if you wanted to tell a story in a book, for instance, or if you were creating a brochure and you wanted to have an introduction, you wouldn't put that text in a font like this because it's not legible. If you're having it at small sizes, for instance, it's hard to read. On this website also, let me point out that when we're looking for fonts on the Adobe website, it gives you a lot of tools for deciding which fonts to look at. If we look on the left-hand side here, we have this set of filters. So I could look at just calligraphy. So then all of the fonts that show up on this right-hand side are calligraphic style typefaces. You could also simplify it further, so I could choose script as a classification as well. And that would narrow it a little bit further, probably. If I was to choose, if I choose clean up here, and then I choose sans serif, the only fonts that are going to show up are going to be clean looking sans serif typefaces. So when you're looking for typefaces, this can be very, very useful, of course. And again, if I want to load a font, I can simply choose it. And then at the top here, I can either add the entire family, because a font family is a set of fonts which are designed to work together. So you've designed one font, maybe the regular one to begin with, and then on this one, it's got a whole set of different text extra light italic, text light italic, text regular, and so on, all the way down to the very bottom here where we've got text black italic. Black is like heavier than bold. So you have all of these different options. The advantage of choosing a font which has a family is it allows you then to use different versions of the same font with different weights and using italics as well for emphasis to create more complex, interesting, rich, hierarchical designs where you're specifying this one's more important because it's bolder, and then we go down a step and we make it smaller and we lower the weight of the font also, so that we create a clear contrast. A contrast is one of the principles of design, right? Big versus small, black versus white. We can see things more easily if there's contrast. So we can understand the information more easily. Which chunks of information am I supposed to go to first? This bit, because it's big and bold. So that's the advantage. Rather than having a font which only has one weight, when you have this variety of different weights, it gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of creating hierarchy and structuring the information on the page in a way which is clearly understandable. So if I go back again, because remember, I clicked on that to choose this particular font. But if I'm in the main area here, we have this menu of options for choosing different styles. You could choose funky, and then let's take off sans serif. So I'm just going to click back onto that so that it's not just sans serif typefaces. Some of these typefaces, like this one, for instance, most of these, in fact, that one you could perhaps maybe get away with it. But most of these fonts, you wouldn't really want to use them for doing regular text, like this smaller area of text right here. This one, you could perhaps get away with it, but certainly not with that one. You wouldn't be able to read the smaller text if you're using a font which is too kind of crazy, like this one as well, or this one even more so. So they have their particular purpose. Usually fonts which are kind of funky, what are referred to as display fonts, and it might also be like futuristic. Futuristic's a little bit different because it has some which might be quite clean like this. But, you know, some of these futuristic ones, like these ones here, are really display fonts. They're fonts which are designed for a very specific purpose and not really for everyday use. It has too strong of an emphasis. It takes up too much attention, kind of thing. It's like having a piece of clothing, which is really crazy. If you wear it once, then everybody's seen it. If you can't really wear it every day then, because it just looks crazy. But if you wear it one time to a party, it's kind of cool, you know? So these kind of fonts, which are more like display fonts, are in that area. So you also have these rough fonts. Rough fonts would be fonts which have a certain kind of texture to them. Something maybe kind of a little bit grungy, like this one here. So if you wanted to give the font, if you wanted to give your design a particular kind of aesthetic feel, where it has a kind of grungy sort of quality to it or an aged quality to it, you could choose fonts like these. So that's the Adobe font site. Let's do, the next thing I'd like to do is do the demonstration for the worksheet. Now, this class is not it's not a software class like I'd mentioned. So we'll use a little bit of a few different software. I'll focus on stuff which is in the Creative Cloud, and I would suspect that most people in this class probably have the Creative Cloud. Many of you have probably done at least the MM100 class, right? Which is where you're learning the basics of Illustrator and Photoshop. Or maybe you've done a little bit of Photoshop yourself, you've played around with it. So I'm not going to be grading too much on your use of the software, and the class is not going to focus on the use of software, but as a way for you to be able to do the designs that you're going to do. You're obviously going to have to some extent, you're going to have to use some kinds of software. So for the first one, the bio sheet, I'm going to do the demonstration actually in a couple of different places, or I'll show you a couple of different options so you can choose which one you think is the most suitable. And I'll talk about the differences between them. I should have one here that's already open, I think. Let me see. I thought I'd got it open, but I guess I haven't. I'll have to open one real quick. Yeah, I guess I don't have one in here, so I'll make one real quick. So this is if you were going to do it in Adobe Illustrator, okay? So Illustrator is one way that we could create a bio sheet, be a pretty legitimate way of going about it. So to begin with, in Adobe Illustrator, if you've never used it before, I would highly suggest that you at least learn a little bit about it for this class, all right? Illustrator is a really good program for working with type for a lot of different reasons. There are some tutorials here. So if you go to Help, Illustrator Help, this will open up a window called the Discover window. And in that Discover window, we have various things. So first of all, there's some suggestions here. Draw and modify simple lines and shapes. If you go down to here where it says hands-on tutorials, these tutorials will guide you through the software in the software. So if you click on this one, for instance, orientation, discover how Illustrator artwork is unique. You click on here and then you start the tutorial. Once you start the tutorial, it will have, my Zoom interface gets in the way here. It has some things that you read. Sometimes there might be an instruction that comes up that it's asking you to do something. This one's actually just a sort of orientation. So, but it will lead you through the software. Anyway, I'm going to exit this one. Let's close out of the artwork. Let's do this one. So if we go to explore shapes and I start a tutorial, it'll basically walk you through the process of working with shapes. You can see it says select the rectangle tool. So you select the rectangle tool. And then once you've done that, it says drag over the dotted area. So you can click and drag over that dotted area. And it sort of leads you through the process. Once you've done that, you click next and so on. So that's one way of doing it. I'm going to exit this. Let's close out that file. And then if I go back to the home area again, so on this home area right here, as well as those hands-on tutorials, which is the ones I was just looking at, and there is a whole bunch of those hands-on tutorials that you can go through. There's also these tutorials. These ones are a video or a set of videos. So to get started with Adobe Illustrator, if you click on this one, then that's a set of different videos, or actually not even videos, sort of tutorials. So if I click on here, you can see that it has files that you can download. And then it has these short videos. They're usually about 3 or 4 minutes long.
There are a lot of ways to begin a new project in Illustrator. You can create one from scratch, start from.
So this is a great resource for getting to know the software better, okay? There's also, remember, on the modules section, I have some useful links. There are some links there to tutorials for Illustrator as well. But I am going to do a demonstration now for the setting up the worksheet. So I'm going to do this in Illustrator. And I'm going to start off by doing Command N, or you could do File New. If you're working on a PC, If I say Command, it would be Control. If I say Option, it would be Alt. But I will try to remember to always say the Mac and PC keyboard shortcuts, okay? So at the top here, when I do File New in Illustrator, it's going to say New Document. And at the top, we have these various options. For this project, I'm going to have you choose Print. And then you have the option to choose letter size. We have various other preset sizes that I can choose from as well, like tabloid, A4, which is a European size, or A3. But I'm going to have you choose letter size for this. So that's a standard kind of piece of paper you'd put into a computer printer, that type of thing. Or if you sent somebody a business letter, you'd set it up as letter size. Over on the right-hand side, there are some particular settings in here. So for instance, it has the measurement is set to points. Points is the measurement for typography, which is why it uses points. But if you want to, we could change this to inches. So you'll see here it says 8.5 by 11. That's a standard letter size. Next to this, it's got bleed. So I'm going to add this, even though really for this project, you don't actually need it. But I'm going to do 0.125 of an inch. And then if these are linked together, it'll fill all of those ones in. So if you've never come across the term bleed before, it's something which is specific for printmaking. So if you're getting something, like if this was going to be printed on a press, I don't mean like on your own printer at home, but you're going to send it out and get it printed on a press, they would print them on paper larger than 8.5 by 11 and then trim them to size. And when they trim them, if you have color, like on these posters you see in the background, I have color that goes to the very edge. That color actually needs to go past the edge very slightly, so that when they trim it, if they mistrim it very slightly, you don't get a little white gap along the edge. So it's just a little bit of an allowance. And it's by default, it's always 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125 of an inch. So there are some exceptions to that, like everything in life, but almost always it's going to be 0.125 of an inch. This is actually set up in CMYK color mode. For this project, it doesn't really have to be honest with you, because we're going to be doing this on screen. So if you want, you can change this to RGB. It puts up this exclamation point. The chosen color mode is different from the color space defined by the document profile panel. Contents may not match the new color. So let's just leave it in CMYK for right now. And then under here, it says raster effects, 300 PPI. I'm not going to get into this in detail for right now, but Illustrator is what's called a resolution independent program. So it's vector based. That means we don't have to worry about the resolution. The resolution in a bitmap image, which is another type of graphics file format. So you could have something either be vector based, like an Illustrator file, or it could be bitmap based, like a Photoshop file. With a vector-based software like Illustrator, we don't really have to worry about resolution because it's not made out of pixels. So in a Photoshop file, because it's made out of lots and lots of tiny little squares called pixels, the resolution is how many of those fit into an inch. The more there are, the smaller they are, the higher the resolution. Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit create. Now I've got my document. If I zoom in on the edge a little bit here, the edge of the document is this, where the white meets the dark gray. Okay, that line is what referred to as the trim line. The red line around the outside is the bleed area. So if you were making this and you wanted it to bleed, like I said, for this assignment, actually, it doesn't really need to bleed. But if you wanted it to bleed, you would need to do that. So if you're going to be sending this out to print, and you wanted to have color in the background that goes all the way to the edge, you'd actually want it to extend past. If you had a photograph that went to the very edge of the page, you'd actually want it to extend past slightly so that when they trim it, you don't get that white gap if they mistrim it slightly. All right. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is I want to create some kind of a structure for my design. This is not a requirement of this project. So for this worksheet, it is a technical exercise, It's a technical worksheet. All of the worksheets are sort of technical exercise, but this is the first one and it's fairly simple. But it is not judged like any of the technical exercises. I don't grade it based on the design at all. So you can do your design however you want to do it. All right. And as long as you submit it and you fulfill the requirements, like it has to have an image of you, and then it has to have some examples of your work, maybe 1 or 2 examples of your work, and then a brief description of who you are. As long as it has those elements on, and you save the file and you submit it to the assignment, and then also to the critique for the assignment. So the critique is set up as a discussion. This way, other people in the class can see your work, your bio sheet, learn a little bit about you, and then I want you to go back and comment on anybody else's bio sheet. So at least 2 other bio sheets I want you to comment on. When you comment on them, I would like you to critique it. When you're critiquing it, you can critique it based on typography. You can critique it based on the elements and principles of design, if you know those. If you're not familiar with them, you could look them up. But elements of design are line, shape, color, texture, value, and form. Sometimes typography, depending on where you read it. And so if you think about it, when you're analyzing something so that you can critique it, the idea of critiquing somebody's work is so that you can give them some feedback on how they could improve it. So if you break it down and you think about those various elements separately, so you go to yourself, what about the color? Is the color working? Maybe. It seems like it's a little bit complicated. It's a bit muddy. Maybe if the color was separated more out and we simplified it down to maybe 3 colors, it would work better. You could talk about it in that regard. You could critique it in that way, just focusing on the color. Or you could focus on line. Maybe within the design, there is a series of lines that connect things together. And maybe those lines are kind of mechanical, but because of the subject, maybe you feel like it should be a little bit more hand-drawn, or it has kind of more of a humanistic kind of quality to it. So when you're critiquing it, try to think about what you could give them in terms of improving it as a piece of design, and look at the elements of principles. Principles are things like, is it symmetrical or is it asymmetrical in terms of the structure? So if it's symmetrical, it's the same on both sides, right? The type is centered, you've got one element at the top, and below it you've got another one, and so on. If it's asymmetrical, it's different on both sides, but it could still balance. In fact, it should still balance, generally speaking. And then another principle would be unity. Do all of the elements within the design feel like they belong together? Is it harmonious? If you think of it like that, like music, you can use discord in music sometimes. So you might start off a piece of music where it's kind of out of tune a little bit, like bam, and then that kind of puts the audience on edge a little bit. And then if you gradually swoop into harmony, there's this amazing sense of relief that comes over the audience, you know? And so in design, sometimes you can deploy a lack of unity. You can create discord in the design, but that's a difficult thing to do when you're first starting. It's a complicated sort of balancing act in terms of design to pull that off. But another example would be like in horror movie music. You might want discord because you want to put the audience on edge. So sometimes in design, you might want to make people feel a little bit uneasy by using unbalance or discord or lack of harmony. So unity is another example of the principles of design. All right, we can create structure in our designs by creating a grid. This is a very common way to do any sort of page layout, which is what we're doing here, where we're laying out images and text together as a way to communicate information or ideas. So let's start with the rudimentary part of a grid structure for page layout by creating a margin. And we can do that in Illustrator by starting off in this top left-hand corner, not the red line, the trim line, right at the very edge where the white meets the gray. I've got my cursor on that corner right now and it says intersect. It says intersect because under view, I have smart guides turned on, okay? So if I put my cursor here and I click, I can set the size of this to an exact amount. So I'm going to set it to 8.5 inches. by 11 inches. So I'm making it exactly the same size as the document itself. The only reason I'm doing that is because I want to make another rectangle, which is a bit smaller, and I'm going to do it by going to Path, Offset Path, and I'm going to offset it by minus 0.5 inches, 0.5 IN. Press OK. So now I have a line which is all the way around the outside, is exactly ½ an inch inside. If you prefer to do this in InDesign, by the way, we could create a print document here, same as Illustrator, right? I can choose letter size. Again, I could switch it in the same place. I could change it to inches. I can set the bleed to 0.125 inches, just like we did in the Illustrator file. With InDesign, unlike artboards, we have pages, so you could specify multiple pages, but we only need one for this. In InDesign, you can also do facing pages, so you could do things like books, magazines, brochures, things like that. Illustrator isn't really set up for that type of design. So InDesign is better for that. We're making a one-page document here, so you could use Illustrator or InDesign. Okay, so I've created this one. In this one, though, in InDesign, we could set a margin right here. So I've set the bleed actually by mistake as the margin, but I want this to be 0.5. And then this is my bleed actually, so 0.125 down here. Okay, so one of the big advantages with InDesign is it allows you, for this type of design anyway, is it allows you to create a grid structure fairly easily. You'll see here that I can set up a number of columns. So maybe I set this to 5 columns, and then I go ahead and hit create. We don't have the ability to make this column grid structure in Illustrator in quite the same way. If I wanted to make rows in my InDesign project, I can go to Layout, Create Guides, and then I'm going to have it set to margins because I want these guides to correspond with the space inside the margins. And then I'm going to set the number of rows. We did this as 5, so let's make the down section into 7. Let's see what that looks like. I've got preview on here, so if I click somewhere else within here, those are my guides. That looks pretty good. I'm creating a bunch of squares on the page, basically. So the idea of using a grid structure like this is that it allows us to have a place to put things on the page, specific places on the page to put things. It's particularly useful if you got into doing multi-page documents like newspapers and magazines and brochures, or even websites. All websites use grid structures. So it's a way of organizing information on a page which is logical. Okay, if we go back to Illustrator, we don't have the ability to make a grid structure like that. So this is my workaround, okay? This isn't a standard way of doing it. This is my way of doing it. So if I offset this rectangle, if you remember, I offset the rectangle ½ an inch. Now, right now, this is a rectangle, and I want it actually to be a guide. So I'm going to go to View, and then I'm going to go down to where it says Guides. And then I'm going to choose Make Guides. I can also use this keyboard shortcut, Command 5 or Control 5, and then that's just a guide around the outside. All right, now to create the grid over the surface, I'm going to use this tool, Rectangle Grid Tool. So if I drag out now from this corner, so inside the margin, or actually right on the very corner of the margin, and I drag out. As I drag out with this tool, I'm creating a grid. If I use the left arrow, I can remove the number of columns. So this is only as I'm still dragging out, all right? If I let go, it's set. So I can keep going down. Here I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down. Let's make it 7, so it's the same as the other one. Okay, and 5 across. Now, on the outside of this, there's another rectangle being created that I don't need, so I'm going to delete that. These lines, which are on the inside, are going to be what are referred to as the gutter. So if we look at the InDesign file, this has created these gutters in between each of the columns. There was a setting for that. If we go back to Layout, Margins and Columns, the setting for that is right here, Gutter. Here it's set to 0.1667 inches. I'm fairly sure that in picas and points that's 14.4 point, okay? I'm not 100% sure, but I think so. One way of deciding what your gutter thickness should be is to base it off of the leading. The leading is the space between lines of text. So by default, if you type something in Illustrator or InDesign or Photoshop or wherever, the leading is 20% greater than the size of the type. So if you had 10-point type, you'd have 12-point leading. Okay. As a way to remember the term leading comes from the fact that when they used to do metal printing, hot metal printing, where they would do metal which is cast out of, the letter forms are cast out of metal, and they're placed in trays. And then in between the letters, if you're trying to create a line space, they would put strips of lead. So the term leading comes from those strips of lead that are placed in between the lines of text to separate them. So here, for instance, in InDesign, if I create a text box like this, by default, it's empty. I can go to type and fill it with placeholder text. If we select the type and I open up the character panel, so the character panel is Command T, you can see here the size of the type is 12 point, the leading is 14.4. So this is the standard size that defaults to in programs. When you create body copy, it's 12 point. Body copy can usually be anywhere between sort of 9 point and perhaps 14 point. 14 point is pretty big for print. If it's on screen, it tends to be bigger anyway. So on screen, it's more likely to be somewhere between 10 and 16 point. There's a sort of range for that. So this is for like where you're reading a story. Again, like anything, there is exceptions, and you might have much bigger body copy depending on the style and so on. But that's a general rule of thumb. So the leading is that setting right here. If I leave my cursor on it, you can see it says leading here. So I'd mentioned that as part of this class, I wanted to talk a little bit about the terminology for spacing. You've got this one right here, which is kerning. You've got this one right here, which is leading, which is tracking, and this one above it, which is the leading. Leading is measured from here to here. Let me show you. So if I zoom in on this, I'm going to turn off the spelling for a second. So right now I've got dynamic spelling on. So this is under edit. You can either do check spelling or you can have dynamic spelling. Because the text that's been put in here is lorem ipsum, this is placeholder text. It doesn't actually say anything. They're not real words. So I'm just going to take that off. Otherwise, everything is underlined with that zigzag red line. All right. Now, if I look at the text, hang on. If I look at the text fairly close up, and I take a guide from the ruler at the top, and I drag it down like this, and we place that on what's referred to as the baseline, and we drag a guide down from here to here, and place that on what's called the baseline. That is your leading. So that distance from there to there is what is being measured by the leading. Does that make sense? So that's the space between lines of text. The kerning is the space between two individual characters. So this is the kerning right here. If I leave my cursor on it, it says kerning in thousandths of an M. So if I put my cursor in between here, I can hold the Option key. If you're on a PC, you could hold Alt, and then you can adjust that either closer or further apart. So kerning is designed for, let's say you're creating a piece of design. Maybe you're doing something, I'll give you an example in Illustrator. Maybe you're creating a logo. So with a logo, it's something that's going to be used in a lot of different contexts. It might be used quite large or quite small. And so you'd want to make sure that you really hone in on and refine the different aspects of it. You know, so if you look at the space between the letters right now, in this particular case, it's actually quite good. But let's try a different word. Let's try typo. So on this one, let's try that as a capital as well. Here's a good example. So on this particular one, if I put my cursor right here, you can see that there's a big gap between the letter T and the letter Y. This is because of the shape of that letter T to some extent, right? So this letter comes in here, this letter comes in here. Now, when you design a professional font, you compensate for that and you do what's called hinting. So when you're using a professional font, you'll notice that they will automatically have kerning set in. This is not a professional font. This is one that I've done. So I haven't really done all of the different things that you'd need to do to make it kern properly. But if I put my cursor between here, there's no adjustment taking place here. So if I wanted to, I could use either the down arrow here and adjust it, or as I did before, I could hold Option and left arrow and bring that closer together. So kerning is about adjusting the space between letters to make them more even, generally speaking. So if you think about the space between each of these letters, we want the overall volume to be basically the same. Imagine pouring liquid in here, or here, or here, should be occupy roughly the same amount of space. Now, like any rule, there are times when you might want the kerning to be all messed up. There's a very famous graphic designer called David Carson, who is sort of associated with a movement in graphic design called grunge, and also one called deconstruction. And his typography oftentimes purposefully messes up the kerning. But it's part of the look, you know? Okay, so here, that's kerning. It's the adjustment of space between two individual characters to even out space over time. Now, there's another adjustment of characters, or the space between characters, and that's this one. This is tracking. Tracking allows you to adjust the space over a set of characters. So over a whole word or a sentence or a paragraph, whatever. So you might use tracking because, let's say you're doing a magazine article and the article doesn't quite fit on the page. You could select all of the text and track it back by, say, -10. And then everything all of a sudden will fit on the page without a problem. You might also use tracking as a sort of stylistic thing. You know, if I was to choose a font like Futura Condensed Medium, let me get rid of this kerning setting. We'll put it back to optical. And then I'm going to change this by going to type. I'm going to change the case here to uppercase. And then if I hold Option and use the right arrow, we can do what's called letter spacing. So it opens up the space. You might do that with a condensed typeface like Futura, because with a condensed typeface, particularly if this was a longer word, when they're too close together, they kind of merge in the eye and it's kind of difficult to read it. So with a condensed typeface like that, you might open them up a little bit. You'd only really want to do it on a relatively small amount of type, like a heading or a subheading, but not on body copy. You could adjust it out a little bit or in a little bit with body copy, but not a lot like that. All right, so going back to the demonstration of setting up the worksheet in a little bit more detail, I'd started making this grid in Illustrator. Remember, I'd used that grid tool right here, the rectangular grid tool, and I've created these lines. I'm going to make these a little bit thicker. So remember that this is creating the gutter, and the gutter is usually, or one way of deciding what the gutter would be, is to use the leading for the body copy. So if my body copy is going to be 14 point, my leading is going to be 16.8. You can always check that in your character panel by doing a piece of type and setting the size, and then checking what it would be at 20% greater. So I'm going to set this to 16.8. Hit return. So then we got these thick strokes. In Illustrator, a stroke is an appearance. In outline mode, it doesn't exist. So that thickness on the stroke is only visual. There's no actual object defining it. But if I go to Object and then expand the stroke, so I go to Object, Expand, press OK. If I look at it in outline mode now, these are filled objects where it was a stroke. So then if I do Command 5 is View, Guides, Make Guides. So we've made those guides that we wanted as the grid structure. All right, so once I've done that, to add text in Illustrator, I choose the Type tool, and I can drag out to create a text box. In Illustrator, it will automatically add that lorem ipsum text. But obviously, you're going to write a little bit about how much you know about typography in general. How much do you know about the subject of graphic design, perhaps? Where are you at in your educational process? You know, are you just getting started? Maybe you're coming back. So talk a little bit about how you fit into the class. What are your objectives? What do you want to get out of the course? And maybe what do you want to do in the future? Do you want to become a graphic designer, perhaps, or a web designer, or a UX, UI designer, that type of thing? And then if you wanted to, you could add, you know, like a web address or something like that. One of the advantages of doing it in InDesign, by the way, is that you could actually add a hyperlink. So you could then save it as a PDF and the link would be clickable. So if I go into here and I'll add my website, so M Creative, I'm gonna have to zoom in a little bit here. mcreative.studio. So if I want this to link, I can go to the actual website. This is the easiest way to get the correct link. I do mcreative.studio. And that by itself is not enough for the link to work. I need the entire web address with this https://mcreative.studio. So I can go back into InDesign. This is not a requirement, by the way, of this exercise. But if you want to do it, you can do this. You have to do this in the InDesign version, not in Illustrator, okay? And then I can go to Window, Interactive. I can choose Hyperlinks. Looks like it's open already. So here's my Hyperlinks panel. I can simply paste that into here. It looks like I lost it. Oh, there we go. When it does that, it creates a style here. So this blue, which is being added to it, and the underline underneath it is being added as a style. If I go to Windows Styles and then go to character styles, this would be made as a character style. Here's my hyperlink. If I double click on it, I could then change the characteristics of it and maybe change the font. And I'm going to change it to Demi actually. And then I'm going to take off the underline. And then under the character color, I don't really have the color I was going to choose. So I would use an orange. I'd have to have it in the swatches first. Although actually I could double click on here, I think, and create it. No, I figured out how to do this the other day. Oh, here we go. So if I double click on here, I can go in and make a new color. So let's add this. I'm going to set this to 85. And then I'm going to set this to 0, and I'll add that color into here. Then hit done, and then press OK. So now this is a link. If I want to test to see if the link works, I can go to Window Interactive. I can choose EPUB Interactivity Preview. I'm going to drag this out a little bit, just so that we can see it a little bit better. And then this is the link. So if I put my cursor on it, you'll notice that there's a finger that shows up. And then if I click on it, it'll take me to the website. Okay, so like I said, you don't have to necessarily do that, okay? If you're doing it in Illustrator, you can't do it. Okay, so if we're doing it in Illustrator, if I want to place an image, so if I want to add an image of myself or an image of artwork, I can go to File, Place. This is exactly the same process in InDesign. You go to File, Place. The keyboard shortcut is different in InDesign. In InDesign, it's Command D or Control D. In Illustrator, it's Shift Command P or Shift Control P if you're on a PC. So I'm going to go into here, and then I'm going to go to project 1 worksheet bio. I have some images here that I can use. So these are the two images I want to bring in. I've got one image of a piece of artwork, and then I've got one image which is a Photoshop file, which is set up as a in Photoshop as a layered Photoshop file. When you place these files, and this is true in Illustrator, not in InDesign. In InDesign, it always places it as a linked image. In Illustrator, you can choose for it to be a link or for it to be embedded. I'm going to embed it. What that means is that all the information for that image is stored directly in the Illustrator file. It doesn't need to know where the other file is for it to work. So if you send me just the Illustrator file and it's linked and I don't have the image, it's not going to be able to work. But if you embed it, I don't have to worry about that linked image. The advantage of the linked image is it makes your Illustrator file smaller. And it also allows you to, from the links panel, you can go in and edit your Photoshop file and it'll update in your Illustrator file automatically. But for this, I'd recommend that you embed it. So if I place these images, when I hit place, I'll get a loaded cursor. And you'll see that next to it, it says 1 of 2. And so if I use the arrows on the keyboard, I can toggle between those two images. If I had multiple images, I could toggle through all the images like a slideshow to see which one I want to place first. So I'm going to place this one first, and I'm going to make it fit across 2 of these squares, like something like that. And then I'm going to place this one, and I'm going to have it go across 3 of these squares like that. Okay. So when you place stuff in Illustrator, it's a little bit different than when you place it in InDesign. When I place it in Illustrator, this is just a free floating element. But I actually want this image to be cropped a little bit. So if I draw a rectangle over the top of it, like this, I can create what's called a clipping group. I can select over both the image and the rectangle, and I can go to Object and then choose Clipping Mask. It's not available for some reason. I must have let go of the selection. Object, Clipping Mask, and then Make. And then the image will be contained within that area. With the clipping mask, I can edit that shape however I want. So on this corner, for instance, I could round the corner. If I click on it with the direct selection tool, I could modify the corner of this pretty easily, like by doing that. If you wanted to have images push text out of the way, which is what's called text wrapping, you could have the image, you could select the image, and then you can go to, I have to remember where this is now because it's different in InDesign than it is in Illustrator. So in Illustrator, it's under type, no, it's under edit, object text wrap. So if I go to object text wrap make, this will then push that type out of the way. So if you want to edit that further with it selected, I can go to text wrap, choose text wrap options, and then I can push this further away from the text. It actually doesn't seem to be working, to be honest with you. Let me see, why is that? It's not pushing it. Object, maybe I missed it. Text wrap make, there we go. So now it's pushing it out of the way. So now it's moving that text away from the image. You see that? So if you want text to flow around an image, you can use text wrap. You can do the same thing in InDesign. It's a little bit different. So if I place an image into InDesign, again, I do file place, same thing, right, as we did in Illustrator. I can find the images that I want. So I'm going to place these two images. And then I'm going to hit open. Again, I've got those two versions I can toggle between. By using the arrows on the keyboard, I can choose which one I'm going to put first. I can go across my panels, my columns, I should say. Now, the difference here is that on the InDesign document, when I place them in like this, they automatically have their own container, which is called a frame. So this image, if I select it with the black arrow, I'm selecting the frame. If I drag this handle at the bottom, I can make that frame smaller. It's not a clipping group, it's a frame that the image is inside of. Maybe here I want to make it smaller too. And then if I use the direct selection tool, I can select the image itself. Notice that there's a little orange frame around the outside. That's where the actual image is. If I click and hold down for a second or two, you'll actually see a screened back version of the image, and you can kind of move it around inside there. So when I'm cropping it, it's not destructive. The whole image is still there. We're just cropping it with that tool. Again, we can modify the shape of this a little bit like I did in Illustrator, but again, it's different the way you would do it. So corner options, I could change the corners here to be rounded. It's doing it on all of the corners right now, and I can increase the amount. I could just do it on one corner if I wanted to. So I could put it all back to none. And then I could unlink them and choose maybe just the bottom corner, and I could make it rounded, and then I could adjust just that bit. You could also do this. You could go to Object, and you could choose Convert Shape, and we could convert this back to a rectangle. Object, Convert Shape. I could choose it back to change it to an ellipse, or what have you. The other thing that you're going to need to put in here is you're going to need to put your name, obviously. So you'll have some text, you'll have your name. I'm going to do my name a little bit bigger. So I'm going to do a separate text box. In Illustrator, I could create a free floating text box. So it's actually not a text box, it's just a free floating type object. And then if I select this piece of type, I can do Command T, and I can choose a different font. I can adjust the size. One thing to think about in typography is what's referred to as hierarchy. So hierarchy is the order of importance. So when on a piece of page layout, there's certain bits of information that you want people to go to first. That's usually like the title, for instance. And then maybe you step down to a subtitle. So in here, maybe I have a subheading here, which is, so the title is my name. And then I've got artist, designer, educator. And then this obviously needs to be smaller now. So I could go up here as well. This is my control bar in Illustrator. In InDesign, it's pretty similar. We have this bar up here. So if you have type selected, again, it would become context sensitive. It shifts towards type. Excuse me. And we can change the size there. I'm about out of time because it's 3 o'clock and I want to try to get this done. I want to try to keep the Zooms to about an hour. So I think I've covered most of what you need to know. You need to know how to be able to place images, so file place, whether you're in Illustrator or in InDesign. You need to know how to create a new document. You don't necessarily have to use a grid structure. You just might find it as a useful way to organize the information on the page so that people can find stuff more easily. And then you're also going to need to know how to export it. So if you're doing this from Illustrator, we might go to Save As, do Save As, save it on my computer. I could save it here as a PDF. So if you give it me as a PDF file, I can view it directly in Canvas. I could download it. And if you're making it from Illustrator, I can actually open it in Illustrator and play with it. All right. If you're doing it in InDesign, oh, you also need to know how to make a JPEG, by the way, because you need to put a JPEG into the discussion. So File, and then we choose Export As. And you can choose JPEG right here. And we'd want to put Use Artboards. So we've only got one artboard in here that we're going to use. So I'm going to use range 1 to 1. And then I can save that out as a JPEG, okay? Does anybody have questions for me right now?
Hello?
Yeah, hey, Robert.
Listen, I was interested in that font list that we opened class with, because my last name is Swick, so it was further down. I've got the multimedia 245 open on my tablet, but where will I find that list?
So that is on the class page for today's class. So if you go to modules,
Yeah.
and then once you've clicked on modules, inside module 1, we've got Zoom meeting week 1, Thursday, 8/31/23. Click on there. And then scroll down a little bit, and then it's there. It's sort of in the middle of that page, okay? So your font is, let's see. Did you find it yet?
Well, I see that I've up to Andrea Juarez, and I'm looking, that was just J. Oh, look at that.
Let me
I'm
download.
Verdana Pro. I get a sans serif font, huh?
There you
Okay.
go. Are you okay with that?
Oh, no worries. That's fine.
So this is the deal. If you want to, you could trade your font with somebody else. All right. The reason I give you all a font, the reason I allocate it is because I don't want everybody doing the same font. I want to get a wide variety of different fonts. If there is a font that you particularly would like to do that's not on this list at all, you could also send me a message on Canvas and you could propose doing that font.
I'll think about it. But look, Verdana is a noble font with a good lineage. I'll think it over.
Verdana is designed by Matthew Carter, is one of the great type designers.
Right.
It's a font which was designed specifically for use on computers. So it has an interesting practical usage, you know, like the idea of why it was designed, which is one thing I wanted to talk about with this project is why are there all these different fonts and why are they designed? They're designed for different purposes to a large extent. So they reflect a particular time in history sometimes, and they have a certain flavor or style, but oftentimes they're designed for a specific purpose.
Right.
Like Times New Roman, for instance, was designed for the Times of London newspaper to take up less space on the page. So it has a high, what's called X height, the height of the main body of the lowercase letters is taller relative to the ascenders than old style typefaces. And so you could get the newspaper could have the same amount of information with less pages. It saved the newspaper money, basically. So it came down to say the same with Bell Centennial is another font. It's actually not on this list, but Bell Centennial was designed also by Matthew Carter. Actually, was designed so that back in the day, I'm guessing you remember this, Robert. They used to have phone books. Do you remember phone books?
Exact phone books, yeah.
So phone books would cost a lot of money for phone companies to print. The Bell Centennial font reduced the size of phone books by about a third because of the way that you could read it at such small sizes.
I see.
So those are the kinds of things that when you're doing this project, I want you to look at that font that you've got allocated, do a little bit of research about it. So on the Adobe website itself, it has a little bit of an about section for the font. But you could do a little bit more research. Maybe you find an article about that
Mhm.
font and where it's designed. Helvetica, which actually isn't on this list because it's not
No.
part of the Adobe Creative Cloud. But
Ah,
Helvetica is another very famous font. There's actually a documentary about that font that I would encourage you to watch if you haven't already watched it. All right.
well, we learned that Gill Sans apparently is the English Helvetica.
Yeah, exactly. It is the English Helvetica. It's the BBC is in Gill Sans, and the London Underground, although it doesn't actually use Gill Sans. The font that was used for the London Underground was designed by the Eric Gill's teacher, and is very similar. They have a lot in common with each other. All right, so I don't think I got to everything in today's class. Let me see. I didn't get to the power of type, which I kind of suspected I wouldn't get to.
Mhm.
I've allocated the fonts. We've talked a little bit about basic terminology. Leading, remember? Leading is the space between. I'll put my camera on again for a second. I turned it off because it saves a little bit of processing when I'm doing demonstrations. So the basic terminology is leading, which is the space between lines of text. Kerning, which is the adjustment of space horizontally between two individual characters. So I'd shown you between the T and the Y, I needed to adjust that space a little bit in the word type because of the way those shapes of those letters work. And then we'd also looked at tracking, which is the space over distance, over a word or a sentence or a paragraph and so on. So we'd gone over that. I did cover most of the stuff. I didn't talk in great deal about the different software, but I'd mentioned the fact that in this project, you can use either Illustrator or InDesign. You could do it in Photoshop, actually. I just didn't want to confuse you by doing demonstrations in all three software. But if you're more familiar with that, I don't really mind for this exercise. I just want you to put the information out there. Use a photograph of yourself, a couple of examples of your work, maybe. You could maybe put a caption against your work as to what the piece of work is. Maybe it was for an assignment or something like that. And then think about the hierarchy, the order of importance, headings, subheadings, that type of thing. And like I said, with this assignment, I'm not going to actually grade it based on the design. So don't fret about it. Get the project done. This one's due, remember, by Saturday. So I have a policy in the class I want to remind you about because it's important. As long as you turn something in, even if it's terrible, I don't care. You're not going to lose points for it being late, and you can always go back and change it up until the end of the semester for a better grade. Now with this, as long as you submit it and you comment on two other people's, you're almost certainly going to get all the points. All right, because I'm not grading it on design. For the first major project, which is due in 4 weeks, I am grading that on design, and we'll do critiques as we go along. All right. Okay, does anybody else have questions? It looks like there's a couple of things in the chat. Let me just see those real quick. So I've got, can you text wrap on Photoshop? Oh, that's a good question. You know what, to be honest, I don't think you can, but I've never tried doing it. Let's have a look, shall we? Oh, I don't have Photoshop open. I would have to check that. I don't know, to be honest with you. Can you text wrap in Photoshop? Hover over the inside of your path and notice how your text icon changes to a cursor with a circle. Click inside the path to begin writing text. Now your text will be confined to the edges of your path and wrap around the edge of the shape. This is wrapping text around a path. Actually, it's slightly different. Wrap text around an image. You could wrap text around an image, which is where it's like making it go along a line. I don't think you can do text wrap though. The simple answer. I can check for the next class and see. I'll make a note. It's kind of an interesting question. And then do you need to zip the files like in 240? So if you're doing it in InDesign, you can just, for this, you can just submit a PDF. I'm not asking you because I'm not going to really examine your files of this, but keep the file just in case we want to look at it afterwards. So the reason for giving me the zip file would be so that I could go in and edit it. But I think for this class, as I'm not really focusing too much on the software, I wouldn't worry about that. Just give me a PDF, okay? Does anybody else have any questions before I take off?
Yes, Professor.
Hey, Francisco.
Hello. I try to do mine on Photoshop by using the text. Is that fine?
Yeah.
And the
So
images?
this is my take on it. Okay, you can certainly do it in Photoshop. Is it the program I would choose to do it in? No, not really, because if you're dealing with text, it's generally better to work with something which is vector based. In this particular context, however, you're going to submit it as a JPEG to the discussion where we're going to look at it. That will be bitmap anyway. And if you make it high resolution, we wouldn't really notice that much difference between whether it was in Photoshop or Illustrator. So simple answer is you can certainly do it for this exercise in Photoshop. It's not the best program, I don't think, for this type of project. Does that answer it?
Yeah. So it'll just be okay just to use it for this project and not.
It's fine. Yeah, I have no problem with you. Like I said, this class is sort of software agnostic. So if you're more familiar with using Photoshop, you can by all means use that. There are going to be some other exercises or projects that I have you do where it'd be more advantageous to use Illustrator, even more so than in this particular context. But I'll point that out when we get to it. But for this, you could certainly do it in Photoshop. It wouldn't really make any difference.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right. Does anybody else have any questions?
Can you mind showing me my the one that the
Submitted?
type I got, because I tried looking at it through my Canvas and there was a server error.
Which one you're talking about? Your bio sheet?
Like the font that I was assigned for.
Okay. Oh, okay. You want me to tell you which one you're assigned to?
Yeah.
Yeah, hang on one sec. Let me see, where's my list? Shane, right? Shane McAdams. Shane McAdams. Rumba. Spelled R-U-M-B-A. Rumba. So let's have a look what that looks like. Adobe font. Well, you could look it up anyway. Does anybody else have questions? All right, let's take off for now. And then if you have, I want to remind you that if you have further questions, first of all, obviously, you can always send me a message on Canvas Mail, and I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible. And then on Fridays are my best day to meet with people individually. So if you need some extra help, maybe you're trying to do the bio sheet and you're trying to do something, you can't quite get it to work. You can send me a message. I'm not around all day tomorrow, like I'll be going out doing some errands and stuff. But most of the day I'll be spent either grading stuff or making content for other weeks and stuff like that. So I'll be at the computer. So if you send me a message on Canvas and tell me what time would work for you, obviously don't send me a message at 9 and expect to do the meeting at say 9:30 or something. Send me a message like tonight for tomorrow morning or first thing in the morning for later in the day or something like that. And then I'll let you know if I can make it at that time. All right. So every Friday is always the same. That's the best day to do individual meetings. All right. I can sometimes do it on Saturdays as well. Sundays is always out. Okay. All right. See you guys.
Thank you. Yeah.